I'm excited. We're in week number 2 of this series that we just started last week, and the series is called The Faith Journey, and we are looking at the story of a man named Jacob in the book of Genesis in the Bible. And if you were with us last week, or you listened to the podcast or saw the thing on YouTube, we started this series by talking about sort of this major difference in how we view our faith. So this is kind of the lens with which we are looking at this series, is that I have come to a place where I've kind of determined that there's sort of 2 major ways that we can look at our faith. The first one is to view faith as sort of a destination, like you've arrived somewhere. You have the answers, you have arrived, and now like you're sort of good to go, and now you're just waiting to get to heaven, and that's faith that just says, I've got the answers, I've arrived. And then there's a second piece of faith, or a different way of looking at it, that rather than looking at it as a destination, we look at faith as a journey. Faith as not as a place of arrival, but a place where there is process and freedom and room to explore. And so we used this analogy last week of sort of like when you go on vacation. If you've ever gone on vacation and you have like a set time, you had maybe 5 or 6 or 7 days somewhere, and you've got an agenda or an itinerary, right? If you go to Washington, D.C. with your 8th grade class, you've got to go to see all these different things. You've got to hit the Washington Monument, the Congress. You've got to do these different things. And that's sort of a strict way of looking at it. That's sort of boxed in by boundaries, whereas if you go on a journey, if you're backpacking around Europe for 4 months, you have a lot of freedom. You have freedom to explore, to go to different places. You have time to sit and wait. You have time to take maybe roads that are less traveled by people and to experience a bit more. And so that's kind of the lens we're looking at, as opposed to a destination where you check off the boxes and do the things. We are looking at faith as a journey, as a lifelong journey where we never know where God is going to take us, but we are willing to follow him. Perhaps maybe the best way to compare the two is simply just to say that when faith is viewed as like a destination or an arrival point, a place that you have come to, in many ways, at that point, God has to submit to me. I have the answers, I've come to a decision, and so everything that I say and do sort of like, it fits in this box that I have created around God. Whereas if faith is a journey, I'm submitting to God at all times. He's leading, he's taking me places, I'm following him, and that may be places that I never thought that I would go. And so that's kind of the difference between an arrival place and a journey, and that's what we're looking at. So last week we started to look at the faith journey of a man named Jacob. And I'm going to give you just a bit of a refresher, some highlights from last week for those of you that might not have been here or don't know the story. Just as a reminder, Jacob comes from a very rich spiritual heritage. Jacob's grandfather was a man named Abraham, who is the father of the nation of Israel. He has lots of miraculous stories that happen in his life. Jacob's father and mother are Isaac and Rebekah. They have lots of miracles in their life. They are strong people of faith. And then we have Jacob. And Jacob comes from Isaac and Rebekah, and he has a twin brother named Esau. So they come from this rich spiritual heritage. Rebekah, his mother, was barren for 20 years. They prayed for 20 years to have a child, and Rebekah got pregnant and had twins. Esau was the older brother. Jacob was the younger brother. And so we looked at the early stages last week of Jacob's life. We looked at how his very name, the name Jacob, literally means deceiver, someone who grasps the heel. He was evidently grasping his brother's heel as he was coming out of the womb, and the name Jacob means deceiver. And we looked at how he actually lived up to that name quite well. We looked at 2 occasions. The first was when he stole his brother's birthright. His brother was quite hungry and famished, and Jacob was making some stew. And rather than being kind and generous and compassionate towards his brother and saying, I've got some food for you, come join, he said, yeah, I'll feed you if you sell me your birthright, which was a big deal. And Esau made a terrible decision to do that, and so Jacob took advantage of his brother. Jacob was willing to take advantage of someone else for his personal gain. And then, of course, we saw the second moment of his deception involved he and his mother, where his father was very ill. His eyes are going blind, and he wants some stew from his son Esau, and Jacob deceives his father, pretends to be Esau with the help of his mother, tricks his father. He deceives his own father, and both stories indicate that early in his life, that Jacob's early life is characterized by self-centeredness, a willingness to take advantage of the misfortune of others for his own gain, and he really has no integrity. He's not a man or a person of integrity. And this was all despite the fact that he comes from a rich heritage of faith, of people who knew God and served him. And so we see this not just in his actions, so he acts in a way that tells us he doesn't know God, but we actually see it in his own words. And we looked at this important verse in Genesis 28, where he after he deceives his father tells him, how did you get the stew so fast? How did you get the game for the stew so fast? And Jacob says to his father, the Lord your God provided for me, right? Not the Lord my God, the Lord your God provided for me. God at that point is not Jacob's God. And so once this happens, of course, his brother Esau is very upset because he steals his blessing. That's what happens. He steals his brother's blessing. Esau finds out about it. He's irate, and he wants to kill his brother. And so Jacob goes on the run. His mother says to him, hey, why don't you go hang out with my brother Laban, about 500 miles away? Get on the run. And so she sends Jacob, who's a city boy. He's a city boy, and he's on the run in the wilderness. And we ended last week with this incredible story in Genesis 28, where Jacob's on the run. He camps for the night. And he takes a rock as a pillow. I mean, there's a part of this that's like Jacob, his brother Esau was the hunter, the gatherer. His brother was a wilderness guy. Jacob is like me going into the wilderness. Like the odds of survival are very, very slim. And he has this dream. He has this moment. He's in the wilderness all alone by himself under the dark of night with a rock as his pillow. And he has a dream. And he has this dream that is famously called Jacob's ladder, this vision where he sees a ladder going between heaven and earth and angels going up and down. And God begins to open his eyes to the fact that there's a spiritual realm, that there's something out there for him. And then God speaks to him. And God says to him, I'm the God of your grandfather Abraham. I'm the God of your father Isaac, and I will be your God. In the same way that I was with them, I will be with you. And through your offspring, Jacob, I'm going to bless the entire world. And so Jacob wakes up from this dream, and he's awestruck, and he's afraid, and all of the things. He has had an encounter with God, perhaps for the first time in his entire life, in the middle of the wilderness. And then we read these words that he says in Genesis 28, 20 and 21. He says this, if God will be with me and will keep me in the way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God. So there's this transition from the Lord your God to the Lord my God. And we talked about in the stages of faith, in the development of faith that a lot of people go through, stage one is awareness of God. It's the first time that we become aware that perhaps there's something bigger out there than I knew. And in many ways, this is probably Jacob's stage one faith. So we're going to continue the story. And we're going to start in Genesis chapter 29. I'm going to read the first 20 verses, and we'll talk about what happens to Jacob. So Genesis 29, starting in verse 1, says this. It says, then Jacob went on his journey, and he came to the land of the people of the east. So that's where his family is, his extended family. And as he looked, he saw a well in the field, and behold, 3 flocks of sheep lying beside it. For out of that well the flocks were watered. The stone on the well's mouth was large, and when all the flocks were gathered there, the shepherds would roll the stone from the mouth of the well and water the sheep, and put the stone back in its place over the mouth of the well. Jacob said to them, my brothers, where do you come from? They said, we are from Haran. And he said to them, do you know Laban, the son of Nahor? And they said, we know him. That's his uncle. He said to them, is it well with him? And they said, it is well. And see, in fact, Rachel, his daughter, is coming with the sheep, he said. And he said, behold, it is still high day. It is not time for the livestock to be gathered together. Water the sheep and go, pasture them. But they said, we can't until all the flocks are gathered together and the stone is rolled from the mouth of the well. Then we water the sheep. While he was still speaking with them, Rachel came with her father's sheep, for she was a shepherdess. Now as soon as Jacob saw Rachel, the daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, and the sheep of Laban, his mother's brother, Jacob came near and rolled the stone from the well's mouth and watered the flock of Laban, his mother's brother. Then Jacob kissed Rachel, and he wept aloud. And Jacob told Rachel that he was her father's kinsman, and that he was Rebekah's son, and she ran and told her father. As soon as Laban heard the news about Jacob's sister's son, he ran to meet him and embraced him and kissed him and brought him to his house. Jacob told Laban all these things, and Laban said to him, surely you are bone and my flesh. And he stayed with him for a month. Then Laban said to Jacob, because you are my kinsman, should you therefore serve me for nothing? Tell me then, what shall your wages be? Now Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the older was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Leah's eyes were weak, but Rachel was beautiful in form and appearance. Jacob loved Rachel, and he said, I will serve you 7 years for your younger daughter Rachel. Laban said, it's better that I give her to you than I should give her to any other man, so stay with me. So Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed to him but a few days because of the love he had for her. Isn't that so sweet and precious? So Jacob has had this experience with God. He has journeyed several hundred miles through the wilderness to come to the land of his relatives, and he ends up at a well with some shepherds, and he says, hey, do you happen to know Laban? And they're like, of course we do. Yeah, he's great. In fact, there's his daughter, Rachel, coming. This is a divine appointment. This is quite reminiscent. Actually, it's fascinating when you read the story of the patriarchs, of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. They have a lot of similarities in their life stories. History repeats itself. Jacob's parents, Rebekah and Isaac, met because Isaac's servant went to a well and found Rebekah there, Rebekah. And that's how they met, through divine appointment. So here they are at a well again, and now Jacob, he meets with Rachel. And so, of course, he tells her who he is. They share this sweet moment where he kisses her, and it's like, oh my gosh, like, I've never met you, but you're my cousin. And I'm just going to tell you right now, you need to get the idea that they're cousins out of your mind, because it's just weird. I'm just going to tell you right now, it's a love story between cousins, and the biggest trick you can ever use in the Bible when you come upon something that you don't quite understand or it makes you a little queasy is you just say it's cultural. That's what I've been taught. You just say it's cultural, it doesn't really matter, and you move on. Like when God sends a lot of snakes to bite people, it's cultural. But they are cousins, and that was cool back then. So they go and they hang out, and Laban, of course, invites him and says, come and stay with me. Come and stay at my house. He's there for a month. They are reunited. And Laban says to him, hey, like, you're working hard for me. Just because you're my nephew doesn't mean you have to work for free. What would you like me to pay you? What should your wages be? The Bible tells us, of course, that Laban had 2 daughters. Leah was the oldest one, and she had weak eyes, or like soft eyes. Basically, you look into her eyes and you're mesmerized, I guess. But Rachel was beautiful in form and appearance. And Jacob was captivated by Rachel. This really was a case of love at first sight for Jacob and Rachel. I can relate to this. Melissa and I met at our workplace almost 15 years ago. I saw her from across the way on a few occasions. And I thought to myself, that girl is beautiful in form and appearance. And as luck would have it, we ended up in a meeting, and I was transferring a case to her, and we locked eyes, and something very deep within my soul welled up. And I said to her, hello, my name is John. You are beautiful in form and appearance. Would you like to go on a date with me? And she slapped me. No, just kidding. That didn't happen. But I did ask her out on a date, and she went out with me. And just like Jesus blinded Paul's eyes in Damascus, the Lord blinded her eyes throughout our entire engagement, and the scales fell off on the wedding day, but by then it was too late. So I can understand this idea of love at first sight. I can understand what Jacob experiences here. He's captivated by her. And so it's interesting because Laban says, like, what are your wages? And he doesn't even, there's like no negotiation. Jacob's like, I'll work 7 years for her. And I think Laban's probably thinking, I was thinking like 3 months, but I will definitely take 7 years. And so he like wins the lottery. And so Jacob works for him for 7 years. And I just love that line at the very end. Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed to him but a few days because of the love he had for her. Shakespeare would be proud. Whoever loved that loved not at first sight. I Googled a Shakespeare quote, and that was one of them. But clearly, he's so in love that it just, a day is like 1,000 years to the Lord, and a day is like 7 years to Jacob, right? And so then let's pick up the story in verse 21. It says this, Genesis 29:21. Then Jacob said to Laban, give me my wife that I may go into her. That's graphic ESV. I like the NIV. And he knew her, but that I may go into her, for the time is completed. So Laban gathered together all the people of the place, and he made a feast. But in the evening he took his daughter Leah, and he brought her to Jacob, and he went into her. Laban gave his female servant Zilpah to his daughter Leah to be her servant. And in the morning, behold, it was Leah. And Jacob said to Laban, what is this you have done to me? Did I not serve you for Rachel? Why then have you deceived me? And Laban said, it's not so done in our country to give the younger before the firstborn. I'll tell you what, complete the week of this one, and we'll give you the other one also in return for serving me for another 7 years. Jacob did so, and he completed her week. Then Laban gave him his daughter Rachel to be his wife. Laban gave his female servant Bilhah to his daughter Rachel to be her servant. So Jacob went into Rachel also, and he loved Rachel more than Leah, and he served Laban for another 7 years. So we have this scene here that can only be described as wild, right? This whole story would make for a fascinating movie. My friend Miriam Miriam, make a movie about Jacob, and yes, this would be fantastic. She graduated in film, so I will help finance it. This would be an amazing story. But he says, I'll work for you for 7 years, and he does it. He works look at your life for just a second and think about like how long 7 years is from where you were, from where you are now. That's a long time. And so then they have a wedding feast. They have a feast, and then the next morning, Jacob wakes up, he rolls over, and he realizes this is not Rachel, this is Leah. Now, I know, I'm just going to say what all of you are thinking. Either they did not have candles back then and it was pitch dark, or Jacob had about 15 too many natty ices on his wedding night. Those are the only two explanations I can think of for how this kind of mishap happens. But Jacob is irate. And did you catch the irony? Did you catch what he says? He says to his uncle Laban, how is it that you deceived me? What have you done? Jacob is the deceiver. Jacob has deceived people his whole life. He is reaping what he sows in this moment. How is it that you've deceived me? Laban has the last laugh and said, I'll tell you what, I'll give you Rachel at the end of this week, but you got to work for me in another 7 years. And Jacob loves Rachel so much that he does it. And so now at this point, the story is going to transition. And I'm not going to read the rest of it for you right now. I'm going to skip a bunch. But I want to summarize for you kind of what happens in the next 20 years of Jacob's life as it relates to his journey of faith. So in the next several verses, really in chapters 30 and 31, we have the story of Jacob living married life. He's got 2 wives. He starts to have children. In that culture, it was very important. Women received a lot of their identity through the ability to have children. That's just the way it was. And so the wife, Leah, that he doesn't like as much, is actually able to conceive first. And so she has 4 children. She has Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. These are significant because the Levites in several hundred years from now will become the priests, the tribe of Levi. And of course, Jesus comes from the line of Judah. So this is where the roots are. Rachel cannot have children. She can't, she's barren, much like many of the history of kind of the patriarchs before her. She's very sad about it, so she takes a page from her grandmother-in-law, Sarah, and she gives her servant, Bilhah, to Jacob to bear children. And so she gives birth to 2 sons, the servant girl, Dan and Naphtali. And this was a bit of a sad practice, in my opinion. The Bible does not say that God endorses it. It just says it happened. But because, in essence, the servant girl was sort of the property of Rachel, the way that it worked was that any children that she had became part of that household. And so sort of she had children on behalf of her, I don't know what to call her, slave owner, essentially. So she has 2 kids. Leah is struggling to have more kids, so she does the same thing with her servant girl. They have 2 kids, Gad and Asher. Leah has 2 more biological sons, Issachar and Zebulun. And then finally, after almost 20 years, Rachel is able to conceive, and she has a son, and his name is very famously Joseph. And later on, she's going to have 1 more son. His name is going to be Benjamin. And these 12 children become the 12 tribes of Israel. So when you read the rest of your Old Testament and you read about the tribes of Israel, the 12 tribes of Israel, this is very significant. This is where they come from. Jacob is the father of the 12 tribes of Israel. All of this takes place over 20 years, and there's a lot more details that happen in there that I don't have time to get into. But what I wanted to say is this, is that during this 20 years, Jacob becomes prosperous. He does very well. He's prospering, he's having children, he's having offspring, he's getting lots of cattle and sheep, and he's becoming very wealthy. God is blessing him, and we also see that he starts to talk about God a lot. So before it was the Lord your God. Now it's become the Lord my God. And now he starts talking about God in his everyday language. When Rachel can't have kids and she comes to him and she starts blaming him, he's like, am I in the place of God? It's God who provides children. There's another time when Laban is sort of harassing him. And Jacob is very clear to say, hey, God is protecting me. God hears me and he's protecting me right now. God comes to him in Genesis 31 in another vision and tells him, I want you to go back home to your family, back in Beersheba where his father is. And he listens to his voice and obeys. And so my point in all of this is to say this, that in these 20 years, Jacob has entered a new stage of his faith journey. So stage 1 is just the awareness of there's a God. But now Jacob is learning what it means to follow God in his everyday life. He's learning what it means to follow God as a husband, as a father, as a business owner. And in many ways, what we see is that Jacob actually starts to gain some integrity. He starts to change the way that he was. His encounter with God has actually affected the way that he interacts with people around him. Is pretty awesome in that way. It doesn't mean that he's perfect. In fact, we see at times he even tries to deceive his uncle Laban again. And so we see, just like you and me, we come to Christ, but sometimes the old person wants to get a hold of us, and sometimes we resort to old habits. Jacob is not perfect, but he's in process. He is in a discipleship process, learning what it means to follow God. So all of that takes place, and then that takes us to sort of the final piece. That takes us to what we're going to talk about at the end of this evening here, this last sort of major passage. It's one of my favorite passages in the entire Bible. It has helped me a lot in my own faith journey. So we're going to turn to chapter 32, and I'm going to give you a little bit of a running start. But at the end of chapter 31, after 20 years of serving his uncle Laban, he decides it's time to go home. He's going to take his wife and his children and all the things that he has amassed. He now has lots of servants and lots of cattle and all kinds of stuff. And he's going to take all that and he's going to go back home to where he came from. And think about the implications of that just for a second. The last time that Jacob was home was potentially 20 years ago when he deceived his dad, stole from his brother, and went on the run. That's the last time that he was home. His life has totally changed. He's a completely different person now, but he is going to have to go back and face his family. We have no indication that his family came and visited him. I mean, it's possible, so I don't want to say something the Bible doesn't say, but we don't have any interactions between Jacob and his father or his mother during this time. And so in many ways, I suspect that this was going to be a very significant time for Jacob. His life has changed, but his past is something he's going to have to deal with. And somehow he knows that his brother Esau is either living in the area or is going to pass through the area. So he knows that for him to go home, to go to the place where God has called him to go to next, he's going to have to encounter his brother. He's going to have to deal with the mistakes of the past. Even though he's a new creation, even though he's not who he used to be, even though God has met him and given him promises for his future, he's going to have to deal with his past. And as followers of Jesus, I think that sometimes we have to deal with our past. Even though we're renewed and we're transformed, even though the old self is gone, we've put on the new self, even though God has removed our sins as far as the east is from the west, sometimes we have to address the wounds that we have caused to others, especially in a life when we didn't know Jesus before. And so at the beginning of chapter 32, he starts to head in that direction. He starts to head home, and he's starting to head towards Esau, and he is afraid. He's afraid of his brother, and so he sends messengers ahead. He sends kind of a convoy ahead to meet his brother in advance and tell his brother, hey, Jacob's coming. And he even calls Esau my Lord. He says, make sure you tell him that I'm his servant and he's my Lord. And so the messengers go, they talk to Esau, the messengers come back and they tell Jacob, they're like, yeah, we met Esau. He said he's going to come meet you. Oh, and also he said he's bringing 400 men. And so Jacob receives this message and he is very afraid. He is caught in this tension where God has promised him something. God has promised him a future. God has told him you're going to be a great nation and all these things. And yet now he's going to go face his brother and he's worried he's going to die. So he is having to trust God right now. And in this moment, he claims those promises. He says, God, you got to be with me. You have to fight for me. You have to be with me and to protect me. He tries to control the situation a little bit. This is all taking place in Genesis 31. And so he tries to soften up his brother. He continues to send like wave after wave of people. So he sends a group of people with like 200 cattle to give to his brother. And you know, Esau's like, what's this? Oh, it's from Jacob. And then he sends, a bunch of sheep. This is from Jacob. He sends a bunch of donkeys. This is from Jacob. So he's trying to butter up his brother. And then we're going to pick up the story in Genesis 32. This is the last passage we'll read today. Genesis 32, starting in verse 22. It says, the same night, Jacob arose and he took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 children. And he crossed the ford of the Jabbok, that's like a river or a creek. He took them and sent them across the stream. Oh, thank you, Bible, for identifying that for us. It's a stream. And everything else that he had. And Jacob was left alone. And a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched his hip socket. And Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, let me go, for the day has broken. But Jacob said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. And he said to him, what is your name? And he said, Jacob. And he said, your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel. For you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed. Then Jacob asked him, please tell me your name. But he said, why is it that you ask me my name? And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, saying, for I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered. The sun rose upon him as he passed Peniel, limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the people of Israel do not eat the sinew of the thigh that is on the hip socket, because he touched the socket of Jacob's hip in the sinew of the thigh. A little biology there for you. So as Jacob prepares to meet his brother, he sends his family up. He sends these convoys, and then he sends his family like over the river. So he makes sure that they're taken care of. He gets them over the river. Everyone else gets over there in preparation to meet Esau. And then verse 24 said, and Jacob was left alone. Jacob was alone on the other side of the river under the dark sky of the night. It is often that when we are alone, that is when some of our deepest soul level work is done. We see this in many cases in the Bible. We see Moses and Elijah. We see Jesus on multiple occasions spend time by himself in the wilderness, including 40 days where he fasted. There's something about getting away and focusing on God that seems to allow God to speak to us. In some ways, we're able to block out the noise and confusion of the world and to spend dedicated, focused time on God. And often when we are alone, God speaks to us. In fact, the last time that we saw Jacob alone was where? 20 years earlier in the wilderness under the dark of night when God spoke to him for the first time. For Jacob to move into what God has called him into, he must face this moment with Esau. He has to deal with his past. In order to move forward, he has to go backward first. He cannot go around it. He cannot go under it. He cannot run from this as he has often done. He cannot trick even himself or others. He has to move through this moment. He has to face it. I mentioned a couple weeks ago in that book that I had been reading called The Critical Journey about the stages of faith that we're sort of talking about, that in many ways when you get past, or not past, but the awareness of God, the discipleship process, many people experience what is called the inward journey, where you start looking inside yourself, start asking deep questions, and many people run into what's called the wall. It's a dark period of your Christian faith where nothing seems to work, and we talked about how you can't go around it, over it, under it. You have to move through this in order to get to what God has to get you to. And in many ways, this is what Jacob is experiencing. Jacob is alone as he prepares for the day ahead of him, and then something very strange happens. This is one of the strangest stories in the Bible. Out of nowhere, it says that a man wrestled with Jacob until daybreak. Jacob is in some kind of wrestling match literally the entire night with someone who just came out of nowhere. We don't know where this person came from. We don't know his name. And it says that the man did not prevail against Jacob. In other words, Jacob put up a strong fight. It says that the man touched his hip socket. He gave him, the picture is like they're wrestling and Jacob won't let this guy go. And then the guy's just like, boop, like pressure point, and his hip socket goes out. And I haven't had that happen before. My sweet daughter Haley has had that happen a lot in her life, some joint issues. So she knows all about like just things popping out. And I think that would be like pretty painful. And so the man pushes his hip socket out and Jacob is sort of hanging on. He won't give up. And he says, I'm not letting go of you until you bless me. Like, what? I need you to bless me. This is our first indication that this might not be a man after all, or just some sort of human. There might be something bigger going on here. There might be something divine. And so Jacob demands a blessing from him, and the man says to him, what is your name? And he says, Jacob. He says, Jacob, huh? From now on, you're not going to be known as Jacob anymore. From now on, you're not going to be known as the deceiver. I'm going to change your name. Your new name is Israel because you have striven with God and with men, and you have prevailed. You have spent your whole life fighting and scheming and deceiving others. You have been known as the deceiver, but you have overcome that. You have prevailed against that. You're no longer that same person. You're a different person, and so you have a new name. Your name is now Israel. And so Jacob says to him, well, who are you? Tell me your name. And the man says, that's not important. And he blesses him. He gives him this blessing, which clearly was important at that time to Jacob. And it seems that as suddenly as this man has appeared, the man disappears. And Jacob realizes that something quite extraordinary has happened here. And he says, I'm going to call this place Peniel because I've seen God face to face, and I've been delivered, or I've been spared. He seems to be suggesting that the very person he was wrestling with was God himself, or at least some sort of agent of God, perhaps an angel. There's all kinds of theories. Was it the pre-incarnate Christ? Was this Jesus coming in human form before he came later on? Jacob is wrestling with something divine, and he realizes that this person actually could have done something to him, but he spared him. Jacob thought that maybe he was winning this wrestling match. It's kind of like when I wrestle with my son, and I allow him to pin me, and I'm like, oh my gosh, you got me, and he thinks that he won, right? And I could very easily, well, not really, I'm not very strong, and he's 4, he's pretty strong, but I'd like to think that I could very easily turn him over and pin him. But there's this idea, right, that Jacob thinks he's in this fight, but really whoever he was fighting with clearly had the upper hand and actually spared Jacob. And then we have this beautiful verse at the end that says that as the sun rose, he began to walk, and he started to journey toward this meeting with his brother, but something was different. He didn't walk the same. It says that he walked with a limp. If you embark on a faith journey with God, I can guarantee you that at some point you will wrestle with God. If you want to be in relationship with God, at some point you will wrestle with him. You see, up until this moment in Jacob's faith, his faith was working for him. Up until this moment, he's following God and he's doing all the things and he's checking the boxes and God is blessing. And of course, there's good times and bad times in there. But in essence, God is being faithful to who he said he was. His faith is working for him. But in this moment, something has to change. In this moment, in order for him to move forward in his faith, he has to wrestle with God. He has to enter a new stage of his faith journey where he's going to wrestle with God. He's going to have to go on an inner journey inside of his life. He's going to have to look inside himself, and he's going to have to wrestle with who he's been, who he is, and who God has called him to be. And I don't know all of the nuances that was going on. I mean, like I said, this is a strange story. We do not know. There's a lot. I mean, this is one of those stories where you're like, I need some more details for like what was happening here. But there was something inside of Jacob that was happening in this moment as he wrestled with God. I don't know exactly what the issue was, but he struggled. If you've ever wrestled, any wrestlers here in high school or wannabes? No, we have a very weak group. Mike, congratulations, sir. I wrestled with my brother a lot growing up, and I know that if you wrestle for about more than 4 minutes, I almost have a heart attack, right? It is a very demanding sport. It takes a lot out of you, and Jacob has wrestled all night. This is a physically, emotionally draining process for him, but it was something that God had for him, and he knew. He could have given up. He could have cried uncle, but he knew that God had something for him, and so he stuck with it. I believe that wrestling with God is necessary for us to grow in our faith. In our faith journeys, there's going to be good times, there's going to be times of rest, there's going to be sweet times, times of peace, times of prosperity, but there's going to be times of wrestling. Wrestling with God is as much a part of our faith journey as I think anything else is. And I will tell you this, when you wrestle with God, you will not be the same. You cannot be the same. You will come out on the other side a different person. You will walk with a limp. You will have scars as a reminder of where you've come from, where you've been, what God has done in your life. And you know what? God might even tell you you're a different person and I'm going to give you a new name. Would you stand with me as we get ready to close? I love that story because in many ways, the church doesn't allow us to wrestle. We've talked about this a lot here, that in many ways, the Big C church doesn't allow us to wrestle. We are supposed to have answers. We're supposed to have scripts. And I think the Bible is really clear that wrestling with God happens, that there are moments in our faith where we just say, God is doing something new and different, and we're wrestling, right? I love him, he loves me, but we are in a fight. And you and I know, I've shared this many times, you know that I am in a process of wrestling with the Lord. I'm wrestling with him, and I'm confident that he has something for me. I'm confident that I will move through the wall, and I'm confident that I will walk with a limp because I will never be the same, but I will know God better than I ever have. Would you pray with me? God, thank you so much for this passage, Lord, this reminder. It's a strange story, God. It's a story that has a lot of details missing, but there's something about Jacob's faith that changes in this moment. There's something that happens to him as he wrestles with you or your representative or whoever it is, God. Something in him changes, and he's given a new name, God. And I pray that we would have the courage to wrestle, but God, I pray you would meet us in our wrestling. I pray, God, that you would bless us, that you would speak to us, and that we would never be the same. We pray this in your son's name. Amen.